ArtsBuild Ontario Accessibility Learning Series. I am your host. My name is Thea Curdy, and I'm the Vice President of Designable Environments. We are currently working with ArtsBuild Ontario as consultants on both this webinar series and the creation of a new toolkit to support accessibility in all creative spaces. We're delighted today to have Marnie Peters of Accessibility Simplified and Martin Day, the President of Safety Media Inc., as our guests, joining us as featured presenters. We'll hand things over to them in just a minute, but first we have a few housekeeping items before we get started. The first is, please be aware that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. Your microphones have been disabled for the webinar, but we hope you can hear us through your speakers and headphones. You can adjust the sound by clicking on the speaker icon at the top of the meeting window. And number two, we're offering closed captioning today throughout the webinar. The closed captioning appears at the bottom of the meeting room screen called Caption Stream Pod, where you, as the participant, can change your font size, color, font type to suit your needs. Would a participant please confirm by typing in the chat box, which is at the bottom right of your screen, that they can see the closed captioning box at the bottom of the meeting room? Excellent, thank you so much. A recording of the closed captioning will be sent to participants following the webinar and will also be made available on our website. Three last things before we get started. One, we will record this session and a link will be emailed to everyone following the webinar. Two, also very important, we will be emailing you a quick survey after the webinar. We ask that you complete the survey so ArtsBuild Ontario can continue to improve their learning series for creative spaces. Lastly, we will have approximately 10 minutes at the end to answer your questions. Please use the chat box at the bottom right to type in your questions, and we will get to as many as possible. Please note that unfortunately the chat box function at the bottom right of your screen is not accessible using a screen reader. So if the chat box is not working for your needs and you do have questions, please email them instead to Erin at ArtsBuild Ontario. That's ERIN at ArtsBuildOntario.ca. You can see it on your screen. And we will ask as many questions as possible during that period. We have a really cool agenda today. We're going to start by recapping about the AODA legislation and what we covered in our last seminar, which was titled Best Practices for Architects, Designers, and Creative Spaces on Accessibility. Then we'll be moving on to presentations on fire safety, codes, and accessibility in creative spaces. And then we'll conclude with question and answer period. Okay, so let's quickly do a recap. One of the things we talked about in the first seminar was what exactly is a disability. People with disabilities are really the minority of everyone. Everyone either currently has a disability or knows someone with a disability or will acquire a disability as they age. We also reviewed understanding what the AODA legislation is about. So AODA stands for Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. The goal of the legislation is to make Ontario accessible by 2025. The basis of the legislation is focused on equality, dignity, and respect. And there are 5 key areas of requirements that are all grouped under what's called the Integrated Accessibility Standard. The first of the 5 is customer service. The second is information and communication. The third is employment. The fourth is transportation. And the fifth is the design of public spaces. So focusing on the built environment, we're looking at the design of public spaces. And in most buildings, that means we're focusing on the accessibility of any exterior paths of travel, outdoor public use eating areas, and outdoor play spaces. It also focuses on accessible parking, and there are two types. Type A, which is a van-sized parking spot, although anyone can park in them, and Type B is a car-sized parking space. Finally, there are three areas about obtaining services that can extend into the building. The first is service counters, the second is fixed queuing guides, and the third are waiting areas, where we focus on any fixed seating. We have to provide at least 3% of the seating for people with mobility-assisted devices. And lastly, of course, if we're talking about codes, then we need to mention the Ontario Building Code, also referred to as the OBC. The Ontario Building Code does have some accessibility requirements, but like the ODA, there are limited requirements. So the question is, can we build a building that fully complies with the building code? Will it be fully inclusive? Well, the OBC really focuses mostly on the needs of individuals who are using wheeled-assisted devices like wheelchairs. So it doesn't really resolve for the full range of abilities people have. In fact, this is one of the things most people don't understand, is that we have a hierarchy to the laws that we have in Ontario. And the Ontario Human Rights Code has primacy over other legislation. When there is a difference or conflict between the code and other Ontario law, the code, or the Human Rights Code, has priority unless the other law specifically states otherwise. As such, the Planning Act, Ontario Building Code Act, and the AODA must comply with the intent of the code, the Human Rights Code, unless otherwise noted. Organizations are required to meet the objective of creating spaces that do not discriminate against people with disabilities unless it would cause undue hardship. Now that's a lot of information, so you probably want to look something more up. And to do that, you can find more information at the Ontario Human Rights Code website. There is also a fabulous resource made available and created through an organization called Gates that created this with the Accessibility Directorate of Ontario and is made available in the resources here in the webinar as well as in the toolkit. So speaking of resources, when you get a copy of this presentation, you'll see that there's a link here to more information about AODA customer service and the type of training you need to do with your staff. AODA information and communication, how to provide alternative formats for people who have accommodation needs, and things like your websites. There's also information about the AODA employment requirements and what that looks like and what you need to be including. And then finally, of course, as I mentioned, more information about the built environment in the design of public spaces. If you have any questions about the AODA and the design of public spaces standard, you are welcome to contact the Ministry for Seniors and Accessibility. This slide shows a variety of different ways to contact them through their website, through a toll-free number or a TTY, through Twitter, through Facebook, through YouTube, or through an email address, accessibility@ontario.ca. So just before we get started with our new topic, we wanted to do a quick recap of what happened in our seminar number 4, Best Practices for Architects, Designers, and Creative Spaces on Accessibility. The first part of the presentation was done by Amy Poitier, Inclusivity and Building Code Specialist at a company called Gensler. Amy had an amazing presentation full of lots of really stunning images with important ideas. She addressed how important it is to empower and have an accessibility advisory committee collaborating with your design team. She focused on how the request for proposal, also known as RFP process, and how it can be used to direct teams to use an accessibility advisory committee. She was talking about mandatory site visits, workshops, how to use additional resources like the City of London or the City of Mississauga FADs or the City of Ottawa's Accessibility Design Guidelines or the CNIB Clearing Our Path. She was looking at integrating the material, furniture, wayfinding, and signage presentations, and how the AAC can be involved with sign-off for all the material choices. There was lots that she included. Definitely worth going back and watching. We also were lucky enough to have Corey Timpson, who spoke to us about design for creative spaces. How can creative spaces go beyond the standard? Corey has a wealth of experience in creating a variety of different accessible spaces, and he focused us on the importance of defining the ethos and ecosystem of design to drive home outcomes that are effective and efficient as possible. We want to make sure that the sum of all the parts equals something that actually is accessible. We spent some time looking at the largest gallery in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, focusing also on their signage and kiosk design solutions. He's covered the approach and authority for clarity of terms, conditions, roles, and responsibilities, and how important that is to get right. But also allowing time for prototyping and testing for things that may not be off-the-market solutions. He also spent some time talking about the importance of redundancy and the solutions available through technology. So definitely worth going back to check out Corey's presentation as well. Now I'd like to introduce you to our amazing presenters for this, our 5th webinar, starting with Marnie Peters. Marnie has extensive experience in ensuring the inclusion of persons with disabilities with respect to addressing fire and life safety and emergency and disaster preparedness. Marnie managed the On Thin Ice project, a 3-year project to address the emergency preparedness needs of persons with disabilities living in Canada's north. Marnie also participated in the development of Planning for Safety, Evacuating People Who Need Assistance in an Emergency, which is created for the Canadian government. She's worked on several other documents as well. Marnie's company, Accessibility Simplified, specializes in major institutional and commercial projects, primarily large public use facilities and environments. Our second presenter today is Martin Day. After 10 years of experience at Bell Canada, Laid Law, and Intra Items Inc., in 2002, Martin moved to smaller entrepreneurial companies, including Doxium, Gaggle Up, and Barclay Payments. In 2016, he acquired Safety Media and has been actively working on developing new, innovative approaches for fire and life safety. These have included a full line of accessible fire and life safety signage, and evacuation maps, and most recently, a software application to help organizations meet their compliance requirements. I'm now going to turn things over to Martin to get us started.
Thank you very much, Thea. I'm very honored to be speaking to you today and very excited to be talking about fire and life safety, and particularly as it relates to being an accessible organization from a fire and life safety perspective. Get the right bullet here. So I'm going to very quickly, I'm going to talk about, do a quick introduction, spend just a few minutes on the fire code. I'd like to talk specifically about what I call the 4 Ps of compliance and fire safety planning, and then talk about some emergency signage principles. But first, who is Safety Media? Safety Media provides fire code compliance products, all the way from workplace health and safety compliance products to AODA compliance products to standard and custom signs. In fact, we have over 4,000 products, and what we don't have, we make for our clients as they need it. We also provide professional services to assist our clients in meeting their needs from a fire and life safety compliance. Our products, on the bottom you can see some very small little pictures, and what they describe is some of those products from a fire and life safety planning perspective, being our fire safety plan boxes, all the way to fire warden kits, to notifications for fire drills, and anything that you would require for fire and life safety planning. Some fire protection equipment, being some emergency lighting and some extinguishers, to some first aid and safety products, including kits and capabilities to keep all of the first aid and safety products together. We do a lot of logbooks, training and codes, and again, signs and custom products. We really work with our clients across many organizations to try and keep all of our products relevant, innovative, and of course, meet all of the compliance needs. Before I start, I'd just like to make a quick observation in the marketplace today. For those of you that manage properties, we hear all of our clients tell us that their risk is increasing. At the same time, the complexity of what they're working on is increasing. For example, we worked with a church not so long ago that was actually a collection of 9 different buildings put together over 55 years. And the complexity of managing in that environment just grows and grows and grows year over year. Oversight is also increasing. Toronto Fire, for example, has hired another 25 fire inspectors, and they have a mandate now to inspect every high-rise building once each year. And of course, in this day and age, who has time? It's decreasing every day we go forward. Let's go to the Fire Prevention Act, the Fire Protection and Prevention Act, issued in 1997. It is law in Ontario. It gets modified very frequently. Most recently, it was modified on March the 15th of this year to make a change which is very small but yet very substantial, where they've taken the code to say that you must keep records, but they don't actually have to be written. It's a very interesting change that has been made that will play out over the next few years. It is a companion to the Ontario Building Code. In fact, legally it sits below it. And the other key point about it is that the local fire inspectors are assistants to the fire marshal, and they have full authority to enforce the code. They are the regulators and the enforcers of the code. The key thing for property owners or people that are managing properties is who is responsible under this code. And unless otherwise specified, the owner is responsible for carrying out the duties of the code. And this duty is not transferable. So the owner means any person, firm, or corporation having control over any portion of the building or property under consideration, and includes persons in the property or building. It talks about supervisory staff, and supervisory staff are people that have some sort of delegated responsibility for the fire safety of other occupants under the fire safety plan. And it can be anybody in the building that works for the owner or who has a relationship with the owner. So as you can see from the picture, it could be the property manager, it could be the construction company, it could be maintenance personnel, or in fact, it could be the cleaners working late at night when there's an issue. And it's really important to note that diversity of staff who is called supervisory staff. It has nothing to do with the fact that people have people working for them, or something that we would in a typical management context think of as supervisory staff. The general duties of the supervisory staff are to A, promote a fire safety attitude in your building. Well, how can you do that? Well, first of all, you have to know the emergency procedures for your staff and occupants. You have to understand the building features. You have to be sure to make sure you have a sound knowledge of all the life safety features in your building. And you must keep egress routes clear and maintain door operations effectively. How many times in a small community organization has somebody thought, oh, I'm just going to leave my pram out in front of the door? Or, oh, if this box is just here for a little bit of time, it'll be okay. Or how about the coat rack that gets put in the fire exit room because somebody couldn't find anywhere else to do it? All of those are actual violations of the code and are very serious should there ever be a fire. You must also have keys available for the firefighters to use and keep them readily available. The supervisory staff is supposed to go to the fire panel if there's a fire and be able to communicate with the firefighters where the particular rooms that they need to go are and what the routes are they need to get there. And you must always review your building's fire plan because it will tell you all the duties and it will tell you all the work that you need to do on a regular basis to be compliant under the code. We call the 4 P's of compliance. We call it Part 2 and Part 6, just to be very careful about what we're specifically talking to. There are many other parts in the code, but many of them deal with the built environment. Particularly what I'm talking about is the maintenance and management of the building under the code. So to be compliant as a building is built and as it's operating, you need a plan. You need a fire safety plan for each building. And it's defined in the fire code which buildings are required to have a plan. And they vary from the size of the building, the number of floors, the number of people that will be in building, the size of the occupancy, the type of the occupancy. And if you're unsure about your building, it's best to either ask a certified fire inspector or to call your local fire department. You need people that are knowledgeable and capable of performing their specific roles within the fire safety plan. Those can include conducting regular checks, inspections, and tests, or they can include the people that are going to be called by the fire department on an as-needed basis. You need property, functioning equipment properly maintained. I always find it interesting when I think of buildings, but what does that really mean? Well, the fire code says it means anything that could cause a fire. Well, what does that mean? Well, that could mean the furnace, that could mean the flues to the chimneys, that could mean any of the equipment, and of course it means the fire safety equipment that we all know and understand as such. Fire pumps, alarm systems, smoke signals, fire extinguishers, emergency doors, all of those things must be kept in a functioning way. And finally, you need to have proof that the equipment is being maintained, which is defined as checking, inspection, and testing as per the code. This proof is required should there ever be a fire and is always called as soon as the fire department comes. They will pick up 2 documents. They will pick up your logbook or your records, and they will pick up the fire safety plan. So let's talk about fire safety plans. These are a very helpful document. They are required, but they are designed to minimize the possibility of a fire. They're designed to provide occupant safety, and they're designed to provide the effective utilization of the fire safety features. Most buildings, or all buildings, will have some sort of fire safety features in them, and it is so important to understand how they work, when to inspect them, when to check them, who's doing it, how are they going to do it, and that is the role of the fire safety plan. It's important also to note that it must be reviewed at least annually, and it must be updated with any changes in the building structure or use. So a small change in the lobby is something that must be reviewed in the fire safety plan to see how it would potentially change that plan. What's in a fire safety plan? Obviously, there's an introduction which just describes the building typically. It talks about the building and the human resources. So it would say, for example, how many elevators are in the building? What is the type of sprinkler system? What kind of fire exits are there? All those kinds of things that are intended for the safety of the personnel inside. It will also define who the supervisory personnel, how they're reached, all those kinds of things. It will provide emergency procedures. It'll provide a short definition of how to control, confine, and extinguish fires. And it will always have alternative measures in Firewatch to things that are used. For example, if the fire alarm panel isn't working, you're required to conduct a fire watch throughout the building, which means that somebody must walk through the entire building every hour and log that there's been no fire. It defines the fire drill procedures. It defines the fire life and life safety systems, and it provides schematic drawings at a very high level of the building. If there was ever a fire, only really the building and human resources component and the schematic drawings will be used by the fire department. And so it's important that these are very easy to access and readily available. To make a fire safety plan, and it's really of great interest to us, is how do you make a fire safety plan accessible? What does that really mean? Well, under the code, it says that the persons requiring that the fire safety plan must have a persons requiring assistance list. This is meant to be updated on a regular basis. Well, that's very helpful, I think, but it doesn't really help you in a place where people with various levels of accessibility will be coming in and out of that building on a regular basis. So it's important to consider what we're going to do about that, and we'll talk about that in the next coming pages. It's also, if in some cases, it's important to have an individual fire safety plan for people with specific disabilities, and that needs to be noted in the whole fire safety plan and building evacuation plan. We believe that it's really important to engage in inclusive evacuation planning and drills. Really important to invite people that require assistance to participate and to actually use the drills that are required under the code to update the list of persons requiring assistance. Should there ever be a fire, one certainly doesn't want to be practicing this stuff because the seconds are all you have. Under the next part for people, the owner and the delegates. Again, things that can't be delegated. You are required to be knowledgeable, and you are required to have both knowledge yourself, but also people that are capable of performing their duties under the fire safety plan. In fact, for the superintendent or the building manager, they should be reading the fire safety plan before they start on their first day. They should have an understanding of it and where their role is in the advent that anything should happen, because it's never going to happen when everybody is ready. So we advise that you have proper training plan in place, you practice your key drills, you practice your procedures as required by your plan. And finally, I've spoken a fair bit about this already, but functioning equipment. The fire code requires that all equipment that could create a fire hazard be maintained properly. That includes the furnace, that includes the fire chimney, that includes the the stairwells, that includes any of the fans that may be accessible for those particular stairwells to ensure that the stairwell stays safe throughout. And this is always validated by checks, inspections, and tests that are always recorded in either a logbook or some sort of record. It is advised that people keep a record of what they see on a daily basis. For example, you may be walking through the building and note that a light in an exit sign is out. That should be logged and fixed as quickly as possible. And as I mentioned earlier, the two things in the advent of an emergency that the fire department will look for is your logbook and is your fire safety.
Martin, this is Alex from ArtsBuild Ontario. I'm just letting you know that you've got about 5 more minutes, as well as when you are speaking, if you could speak directly into the microphone, that would be really beneficial for our listeners.
Okay, sorry, I thought I was. So my apologies there. I'll adjust the screen. Okay, so very quickly on emergency signage. The key thing here, keep it simple, keep pictograms, keep it tactile, and work with Braille. And balance the inevitable tension with various laws, regulations, and requirements that exist. When you're building and placing an accessible evacuation map, we recommend that it be tactile, that it use grade 1 Braille, that it have large text, have a high traffic location, be easy to orient, but have limited but important information. How many evacuation plans have we all seen that are on the size of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with every single fire piece of equipment on it, every single smoke alarm, every single pull station, all stuff which you're not going to need if you need to evacuate. So keep it simple, keep it large, and make it work as quickly as you can. I'm going to skip this fairly quickly. One of the key benefits that has recently been released to help all of us in this process is a new standard called the CSA B651, which provides for signage best practice. It provides how to build the sign and where to put the signs to enable that built environment be easily accessible. And some of the keys that it talks to are to avoid shadows and glare, to keep the text as sans serif, upper and lowercase, minimum contrast of upper and lowercase, minimum 25 millimeters in height. Make sure your tactile is of a sufficient depth, 0.8 millimeters to 1.5. Make sure your pictograms can be seen, being 150 millimeters in height, and make sure it's properly located against the floor, above the floor, and away from the door jamb. Some signage examples: accessible signage marked with tactile and Braille, exits with areas of refuge differentiated. Make it easy for people to get to where they need to go as quickly as they can. The floor level as well as the higher levels to account for smoke. If you put the sign down low, if you're crawling out of the building, you can see it. If it's at eye level or above a door, you probably won't even see it. Keep the egress paths clear and keep them well located and well signed. And of course, keep your in case of fire and 911 signs. I mentioned grade 1 Braille. One of the things that I noticed is most buildings actually use grade 2 Braille or contracted Braille because it is the US standard for ADA. Grade 1 Braille, which is adopted by the CNIB, is the Canadian standard. And being nice Canadians, the ruling says that as long as you can fit the Braille in, you are asked to use grade 1 Braille. And in signage, our perspective is that is the only acceptable solution in Canada. So rushing along here, we do recommend that people go beyond the minimum. Codes are constantly changing. There are many low-cost options to improve building safety for both able-bodied and disabled people. Fire safety best practices are constantly evolving, and accessible fire safety is a differentiator. All that I've spoken about in the fire safety plan doesn't necessarily require you to hire anybody. Fire departments will all provide a template for you to create a fire safety plan. They will generally provide good assistance. But if you want help, there's lots of people to give you help if you require it. You can make a difference to all of this. You can certainly help with the accessibility, and we think it's a great way to move forward and meet the requirements of the code long before 2025. So with that,
Thank you
I'd
very
like
much,
to pass it
Martin.
to Marnie.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm just going to quickly summarize some of the excellent points that you made today. The fire code is a companion to the Ontario Building Code, which I'm sure most people don't know. That it's important to promote fire safety attitude in the building. And I loved your overview of the fire safety plans, how you summarized the 4 Ps under parts 2 and 6, how you gave us an overview of the table of contents, which many people have never seen, and then thinking about the accessibility and how to keep people with disabilities safe, which I'm sure Marnie is going to be talking about more, and the options for accessible signage requirements and those details. So without further ado, I'm now going to pass it over to Marnie.
Thanks very much, Thea. I'm really excited to be here today to speak to you about accessibility in creative spaces. And I hope everybody can hear me okay. So I've been working in the field of accessibility of the built environment for over 20 years. And I guess of relevance to this particular conversation is some of my most recent work I did was working with the Ottawa Art Gallery. I worked with the new build of the Ottawa Art Gallery, but as part of that, we also went through the heritage buildings of Arts Court and looked at how we could integrate the two buildings, but also how to address the accessibility of the old building as well as the fire and life safety component. I also had the opportunity to work on the Museum of Nature, and we again looked at the fire and life safety within the heritage context, but also as part of the building was being redeveloped, we also looked at signage as well as the exhibit space and how to make exhibits themselves accessible. So the first part of my presentation is about accessibility of the built environment and addressing fire and life safety, which is how I first actually got into fire and life safety, was working on elements of the built environment. And so, you know, for so long, people with disabilities have sort of had that fight of accessibility, get me into the building, get me into different facilities. But what has been lacking is the same attention being paid to egress and the ability to get out of buildings. The Ontario Building Code was updated in 2015 with a number of specific amendments related specifically to accessibility. And one of those changes addresses ensuring signage where the egress route differs. So, you know, we're all familiar with the exit sign and, of course, the new running man that's been adopted by the National Building Code and is being adopted throughout the rest of the provincial building codes. But what's lacking often, and you can see from this this photo, which is of the running man, you know, with an arrow saying the exit's this way, and then you get there and you find out that there's 4 stairs. So obviously this is not an accessible egress route. And so where the accessible egress route differs from the ambulatory route, there needs to be specific signage now, noting what the difference is. And so this photo illustrates the inaccessible egress route, but also some different ways of providing information. So in this case, it's using the handrail, and the handrail at the top and bottom has the addition of some tactile and braille information. So it tells you you're on the 5th floor. It, you know, sort of tells you obviously which way is up, which way is down. So it's a different way of providing information related to the built environment. So when we talk about building code requirements, Thea touched on it earlier about sort of the supremacy and hierarchy of building codes and standards. And as I mentioned, the Ontario Building Code was updated to indicate, you know, where the accessible egress route is different. It needs to be signed. But we also want to talk about things like illumination in stairwells, stairs and ramps, doors and exit signage, fire pull heights. They're all standardized, but also, you know, not only where the fire pulls are, but often the things that we do to impede access to the fire pulls, like putting garbage cans, putting plants, putting different pieces of furniture. So we have to remember that this is like safety equipment, and it needs to be maintained clear at all times, because you don't know who it's going to be that actually pulls that fire pole in an emergency. So we also talk in the built environment, about visual alarms. And visual alarms are especially important for people with hearing disabilities who cannot hear the fire alarm going off. So they need another means of getting the message, the notification that there's an emergency. So visual alarms originally in the code were required in big open spaces, which, is a bit redundant really, because in a big open space where there's lots of people, so for a person who's deaf or hard of hearing, if everybody starts running out of the building, I can assure you they are also going to run out of the building. They may not know why, but they will leave. But it's really important to have visual alarms and other, similar notification systems in places where people could be alone, such as washrooms, such as small offices. It's important to think about where people won't get sort of that obvious message by what other people are doing. The other thing that we like to talk about, and I try and work with my clients to incorporate, is visual signage that provides real-time messaging. So if you're operating a really large, say, facility like an art gallery, and you have a PA system and it says, we are having an emergency on the 3rd floor, please everybody evacuate. Well, if you're deaf or hard of hearing, you don't get that message. And so real-time signage would, people would be able to see and read like, oh, there's an alarm and there's an evacuation because there's a fire on the 3rd floor. So we need to think about alternative ways of providing information. And while the building code doesn't require it, the Ontario Human Rights Code actually requires that you not create a facility that discriminates. And by only having audible announcements, you're in fact discriminating against people who cannot hear. So it's important to bear that in mind, that the building code is not like the end-all and be-all that you're working to achieve when it comes to accessibility. The building code, as it relates to accessibility, is the lowest bar. It's essentially saying you cannot do any worse than this. So when it comes to fire and life safety, which is not well addressed in the building code, it's really important that you push for more, that you say, no, we need to think about who all of our users are. And this is where Thea touched on the use of the RFP as a tool. So you can require in your RFP the different codes and standards that your contractors and your architects must meet. And you can say, I want the best of all these different things. And by doing that, you're able to go beyond what's the minimum and look at ways at meeting the needs of everyone. So this is where I talk about code improvements too. So right now I mentioned the requirements for evacuation routes, but also now there's more incorporation of the use of areas of refuge or areas of rescue assistance. Essentially they're the same thing. One is more of an American name, one is more Canadian. And so there's only a requirement in certain circumstances for areas of refuge and rescue assistance. But if somebody has a mobility disability, they don't care if they're on the 2nd floor or the 10th floor. The point is they still can't go down the stairs. And so having areas of refuge or areas of rescue assistance and stairwells and other, protected areas is a benefit to a lot of people, and not just, on the 10th floor. So it's important to consider where you might be able to do better. When we talk about evacuation instructions, we all, everybody runs the elevator, says do not use the elevator in case of fire, but it doesn't tell you what you are supposed to do. So it's important to think like, I can't just tell them not to do it, I got to tell them what it is I want them to do. So use of elevators in emergency situations. So elevators are becoming more commonly used in new builds and properly being built so that they can be used in emergency situations independently without firefighters. It requires, a specific build of the elevator, but it's possible to do. That will also need to come with some public education, though, about yes, you can use this elevator, as opposed to always being told that we can't. So here we have an area of rescue assistance. So it has very specific components. It needs to be identified by signage. It needs to have a communication system that is always monitored. And it needs to have space allocated outside of the flow of the evacuation route for people who use mobility aids. And it needs to have positive air pressure, and that's to make sure that you don't have smoke in the space. And so it's not just like, oh, I have extra space in this stairwell. It can be an area of rescue assistance. There's really specific design components that go into ensuring a safe waiting space. And the point of this space is not so that you don't have to make a individual evacuation plan, or you don't have to worry about it. It really is meant as a temporary waiting space until either the flow of people have left and you can now execute your evacuation plan and evacuate with people who are able to assist you, or you can wait there for firefighters. So Martin talked a little bit about signage, and you'll see a bunch of photos there, and that's really sort of the progression of where we have gone with exit signs. First, with the words, which is not great if you don't speak English or French if in Quebec. But now we've seen the progression of signage sort of universally move away from text and move more towards pictograms. And this shows the evolution of the exit and then the running man. And now we're starting to recognize that people using mobility aids, people who are pregnant, people with a broken leg, all these people who can't run down the stairs also need a means of exit. And so we're looking at more universal evacuation routes also, not just like, okay, this is the way everybody who can run is going to go, and this is the way everybody who uses a mobility aid is going to go. It's really about thinking about the design and making sure it's a route that everyone can use, so everyone's going in the same direction. Elevators for evacuation, I did touch on that as a code, not only a code change, but also sort of a design change. So they have a specific sign, emergency evacuation lift, so it's to understand that it can be used in fires. Sorry, I know I'm kind of whipping through and not exactly following the text, but I know we're a little bit pressed for time, and I want people to be able to ask some questions. Martin touched on evacuation maps, and sort of this is what we typically see, this tiny little map where you can't really see where you are and you can't really see where it is you're supposed to be going. And so we want sort of like bigger signs, also only showing the key points. So it's too bad I made this picture kind of small. But what I really liked about this particular evacuation map that I saw in a building was they actually had the wheelchair logo on the doors that had the accessible egress routes. And so as somebody who uses a wheelchair, for me, I was like, oh my God, somebody thought about what my needs are. And it sort of ensured that I knew that there was directions and places I could go that were accessible. So a little bit of thinking outside the box goes a long way when it comes to fire and life safety. So similar to Mark's, yeah, go ahead. Okay, yep. So this is a tactile map similar to what Martin had shown, just showing the really key and important things. So this one has tactile and braille, just letting people know where they should go. So this part of my presentation, though, is about addressing the specific needs of people with disabilities and functional limitations. And so in facilities such as, art galleries, theaters, you just never know who's going to come. And so it's important that you have information for staff and visitors. So having tactile maps available, having available evacuation plans, because some people are going to want to know. So when they walk up to the person at the front, like, how are you going to get me out of this building if something happens while I'm in here? Providing emergency information in alternate formats is important, but also having your information on your websites about emergency procedures so people can look it up in advance of when they go, so they have the information in the format they're able to receive it in. The Canada Labour Code actually only applies to the federal government, but I mention it because it has some really great information about how to create individual emergency evacuation plans for staff, and also you can use it as the basis for creating plans for this is what my staff is going to do if it's a person who uses a wheelchair. This is what my staff is going to do if it's a person with low vision. So there's just some really great information in it. There's the link there, the Part 17, Safe Occupancy of the Workplace. That's where you'll find the information about creating individualized plans. So here we talk about personal emergency evacuation plan. It's you know, you can make it for each different type of disability, as I mentioned, whether it's staff or visitors. And don't assume that people that there won't be people with hidden disabilities. Not every disability is visible. We often think about, oh yeah, that's a wheelchair user. Obviously they have a disability, or that person is using a long white cane, so they have a disability. But we need to think about, like, my mother who's 70 and just had a heart attack. She'd say she doesn't have a disability, but really she's not going to run down the stairs anytime soon. So it's about keeping an open mind and trying to plan for and address all the different types of disabilities. So when we talk about evacuation issues, Martin had mentioned people with disabilities rarely take part in evacuation exercises, but it's important that that be practiced at some point. People with disabilities often don't necessarily self-identify or say, hey, I'm going to be in the building. So does your staff and people working in your building have different ways to communicate? Do they have different ways of communicating with people with different disabilities? Have your staff been trained? Thea mentioned the customer service standard that's required by the AODA. As I just talked about temporary disabilities, and some people with disabilities may refuse help or assistance. Whether they might need it or not, they might just feel that they can manage on their own. And so you can offer assistance, but don't be offended, and if they don't take it, and don't expect them to take it just because you offered. Staff training is important, and developing personal emergency evacuation plans, like I mentioned, for staff. And you know, if you have a frequent visitor, somebody who's there often and they have a disability, you may wish to work with them to develop a specific plan for when they're in your facility. And it's important to document your emergency procedures and what you're going to do for all those people with different types of disabilities. Staff training, I think I mentioned that just a little bit. I'll just keep going. And I guess my final part is we're all human. So ultimately, each of us is responsible for our own fire and life safety and emergency and disaster preparedness. And that includes when people go to your facilities. That doesn't mean they're always going to be prepared, which is why it's important that your facility be prepared to address all those different needs. Did I make my 5 minutes?
You sure did, Marnie. Thank you.
Sorry,
okay,
that was a little
so
fast.
Before we get questions, no, that's okay. You did great. So before we get to questions, I just wanted to summarize the amazing points you were making. Thank you for pointing out your work at the Ottawa Art Gallery and the Museum of Nature. I'm sure when people are in Ottawa, those will be good places to go look for some things. I appreciated your point about the importance of being able to get out of the building on an accessible route, and that you need to provide directional signage for where those accessible exits are. I really appreciate, too, that you were talking about how even though the OBC was updated in 2015, that those requirements, including things like the visual alarms and where those locations really need to be placed to be useful, that also that the building code is really the minimum or the least you're allowed to get away with doing, and doesn't necessarily meet the Ontario Human Rights Code requirements. The fact that you talked about the audible announcements that might be made and how to think about how to make them visible so that people who are deaf can get that important information. Again, emphasizing that the RFP is a great tool to set higher standards as a part of your design contract with the architect and the contractor and the other people involved with the process. And then mentioning things like areas of refuge or rescue assistance that many people haven't heard about, the use of something called an evacuation chair, which again, many people may not be familiar with. And I appreciate that both you and Martin were talking about tactile evacuation maps, which are reasonably new to the marketplace. The importance of providing information for both your staff and the visitors and ways to do that. And then the fact that the Canadian Labour Code, which is not required for everybody to use, is a good resource. Okay, so now we'll just quickly have some time for some questions. We started just a couple minutes late, so we'll go just past 1 o'clock to get started. So if you would like to ask a question to either or both presenters, can you please type that question in the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner? And as they come in, I would be happy to read those. So we have one question already from Natalie from the Art Gallery of Northumberland. Her question is about the fire safety plan. She says, my art gallery is within another building. Do we need a separate fire safety plan, or can we rely on the one for the main building? Martin, maybe that would be best going to you.
That's a very great question. The answer is it rather depends. It's always best to have your own fire safety plan, but often if the art gallery is within another building, as long as that fire safety plan covers the unique requirements of your location, it generally is acceptable to the fire department.
Hi, it's Marnie. And I would also just add, though, if you have staff or frequent visitors with specific disabilities, that I would recommend that you create your own specific plan for how your organization is going to address the needs of people.
Okay, we have some people typing, but while they're typing, Marnie, I was wondering if you might talk to people a little bit about how they need to think about their space planning when they're perhaps, even before they hire the architect, if they're going to include something like an area of refuge, what does that mean in terms of how much space that's going to need?
Right, so when we're talking about, so what Thea is talking about actually has a term, and it's called the functional programming. And, architects deal usually with a set of parameters, existing parameters for functional programming. That often doesn't account for the additional space that's required for wheelchair users or people who use large mobility aids such as power wheelchairs and scooters. And so when we're talking about areas of refuge, you want to make sure that there's enough space for 2 mobility devices. And so the space is about 800, so we do everything in millimeters, so 800 millimeters by 1370 millimeters, so 1.3 meters. And you want to make sure that it's clear out of the evacuation route so people aren't sort of being trampled. So it's important that when you're thinking about these things, you don't just leave it to the architect to say, okay, we're going to put stairs over here, when you're thinking, okay, I want my stairwell to have multiple functions, because you need wiring to go there, you need mechanical to look at it to ensure the positive pressure. So it's about identifying what are the needs that you want to have addressed, not just leaving it up to the architect to come up with certain things like, as I mentioned, like, oh, we'll just fit the stairs in here. So think about your own needs before you engage the architect, and have a list of things that you want to have incorporated. So that kind of forces the architect and designers to maybe look at things from a different perspective.
Thank you very much, Marnie. Okay, we have time for one last question. The question is, our small theater is upstairs with only elevator or stair egress. How do we find out if our elevators are able to be used?
So usually elevators in existing buildings most likely have not been designed and built to the fire requirements necessary for fire elevators. So they're typically used right now only under the supervision of the fire department. So in that case, you would want to set up, an area of refuge or rescue assistance. And if you're in an older building, You're also probably going to have trouble meeting all of the requirements in terms of positive air pressure and separated space. But it's important then that you work with your fire department and say, you know, we've identified that this is a challenge. We want to make sure that we can safely evacuate people in an emergency, and work with them to identify like a safe waiting space, either nearby the elevator or nearby the stair, so that when the fire department does arrive, people are in a place that's easy to access for the fire department.
Thank you very much, Marnie and Martin. That was an amazing set of presentations, and I appreciate everybody who signed up today. Apparently the event was sold out, so that's fantastic. We just wanted to very quickly then conclude with talking about our next webinar. Our sixth and last webinar is called Invisible Disabilities and Creative Spaces. This will be held on Tuesday, May the 14th of this year, with presenters Alex Bulmer from the Accessibility, who's an accessibility consultant and actor, and Andrew Gurza, who's a disability awareness consultant. So be sure to sign up for that as well. Of course, we would like to very much thank the ArtsBuild Ontario Accessibility Advisory Committee for their information and input into these webinars in the 6-part series. We would also like to acknowledge and thank the Government of Ontario for supporting this project. Just as a reminder, please look for the email that we will be sending you of the recording from today's webinar, and also please complete the survey that will be attached. Thanks again to Martin and Marnie for your wonderful presentations. Be sure to check out the rest of the learning series and the previous webinars on the artsbuildontario.ca website. Thank you so much for attending. Have a great day.